Pax hummed to himself as he paddled steadily up the river, enjoying the multicolored reflections of dusk sparkling and rippling across the water like fireworks. It had been a long trip, but a profitable one. He had tripled his hunting quota for the month, which meant more time in the market than he was comfortable with. Even with a different name, his face could always be associated with the old one by those who knew of his past. The less opportunity to be recognized, the better. While he had hoped to be home a couple hours earlier, he knew the lanterns of their dock would be visible any moment now. The supplies he had secured with the extra coin would last them at least a couple months without him having to leave the family at all, something that comforted both he and Wensy. He smiled as he thought of the girls' faces when he told them tonight before story time at the hearth. Perhaps he and Atehn would have enough time to work on her archery so that she could accompany him when he returned to hunting. He had carved a new bow from a wood so elastic he was hesitant to fire it himself, lest it snap from his practiced physique. Hopefully, this would give her an edge on speed due to its lightness and power from the abnormally limber make. He pondered fondly the opportunity for company on his excursions. He knew it would be a change, not just the extra time together, but also the constant risk. What if she drowned in the river, got trampled by a horse in town, not to mention taken by some predator? While he had trained her in basic sword techniques in addition to free sparring, and her aim was impeccable, even if lacking in power, she didn't seem to have the heart to follow through if necessary. Though he didn't want to pressure her into killing, he knew that until she was capable of doing so, his attention would be split at times, when focus and awareness were necessary for their survival. Some would recommend forcing her hand, rather than letting the decision come in its own time. The Hobbit Pax used to be knew very well what it was like to be conscripted, conditioned, and pressured into the taking of life. That was something he hoped never to ask of his children. Pax stared blankly ahead, not paddling, as if pulled into a void. Since Bywater, sometimes his mind would retreat rather than return to the memories of death on that horrendous day. Distant echoes of steel against steel or bone, the thwang and buzzing of archers, the roars of the big folk, and the shrill screams of fearful hobbits. Paxon returned to his body as if dropped from a tree, jolting before sitting upright, angling his head slightly to the right. Two flickering lanterns were visible a ways upriver, and the screams of his family pierced the night air. Knowing he couldn't paddle the distance quickly with the extra weight of supplies, he turned to his anchor rocks on either side of him and pushed them into the water. He stood, strapping a handful of steel-tipped arrows to his bow. He then secured it over his back with the string across his chest, and without waiting another moment, dove into the river, swimming fiercely against all traditional Hobbit sense. Wensy gasped for breath as she backed away from the bolted door, clutching Jabala to her chest. A dull thud sounded against the door, followed by quick scratchings against the wood. It wasn't until the tiny hobbit in her arms whimpered and she was reflexively stroking Jabala's hair in comfort that she realized Atehn was still outside. She automatically called out her name but cut off when this invigorated the assault on the door. Besides, Wensy didn't want to worry or beckon her daughter to endanger herself. The beast bashed and scratched, but little did it know that this burrow had been built to withstand such attacks, something Wensy was very well aware of, though they had not endured one since her late childhood. The frame and door were solid and reinforced from the days before the barrier, when predators such as this dire fox prowled the hollow freely. Wensy couldn't fathom how the beast could have worked its way into the hollow. She knew if it was a creature of the old forest, that the watching ones would not intervene should the defenses fail. They did not take sides in such petty matters as hunter and prey. Even though they had dealings with the Shadefeet since before she was born, Wensy knew the forest would not save them any more than it aided their adversary. It would depend on the cunning and constitution of hobbits, those that built to endure the whims of the many beings larger than themselves. Even if the small windows were broken, it would take a great deal of work to widen the hole, seeing as the house was not only built of wood, but lined with rocks, as it was buried, rounded like a mound. Had he been informed, the fox probably would not have been deterred from its pursuit, since the tender smells of plump meat had driven him into a frenzy. Nor had he been told that while he stealthily made his way up the hollow, just downwind of him was the very morsel that had initially caught his attention in the forest, and she was tracking him. Had he known this, he surely would have made quick work of her, since it wasn't until he was rounding the mound of the burrow that she acquired her discarded weapons. While he was startling the pregnant mother who was sweeping off the porch, the short shadow scurried up the back of the sloped house. Then, as he frantically attempted to acquire his fortified meal, Atehn drew her first arrow. All of this would have given him vital information when attempting to figure out what in tarnation had suddenly stung him in the leg. The grimy fox yelped and snapped at the arrow Atehn had launched into his thigh after taking far too long a time aiming at its head before deciding to maim instead. She knocked another arrow while mentally forcing her will against the wretched beast to flee rather than risk further injury. There was a clatter against stone as the arrow dropped to the walk path. Since hers bore no metal or stone heads and were just sharpened, they were not as difficult or wounding to remove. The large gray fox stilled, peering anxiously about before turning its head back towards the door and taking a step. Atehn tightened and took aim at the front leg on the same side she had struck before. "Atehn!" wailed a tremoring child's voice, muffled by the door below. Atehn and the creature jumped, and between both movements the shot did not connect, but bounced off the stone path nearby, causing the fox to leap to the side in bewilderment. It froze, covering its face and body with its tail before scanning about with its eyes and ears as Atehn remained motionless in the dark atop the mound of her home. She reached back to grab another arrow, but the fox was now attuned to the silence, and as the shafts clinked lightly together, its head turned swiftly in her direction. As soon as she saw this, she fumbled with her preparations before drawing the arrow and nocking it. By the time she drew back to aim, the spry creature had bounded around the curved sides of the door. It regained its footing with a quick dash and leapt towards Atehn's high ground. Without time or wits to properly sight in, she dodged to the right while shifting to launch a wild shot at the side of the animal. The move caught it by surprise, but due to her wobbly motion, the tip barely pierced its hide, and it fell ineffectively as he passed by her. Atehn impacted the roof, tucked her arms around her head, and allowed herself to roll down the house towards the front like she had done so often in play with her father. "Where is he?" Her momentum spent, she pushed herself forcefully off the flat ground, raising her eyes to see the rest of her arrows scattered down the hill. The fox had recovered from its pained tumble down the rear of the house and was approaching more carefully back over. Now that she was exposed, looking up at the creature rather than prowling from above, she couldn't help noticing it was not only twice her height and length, but at least eye to eye with her. The small hobbit's hands trembled as she gripped her bow at either end, holding it in front of her in a warding motion as her panic began to simmer. The shadowy beast leapt down for her, and she jumped backwards. Raising her arms in defense, Atehn placed the middle of the bow between its open jaws, catching it off balance. She released immediately, pushing to the side as she had done before, while the fox shook its head violently to dislodge the bow held in its mouth, with the string now tightly clamped over its snout. She drew Ingal and gratefully strapped her required shield, Donatok, to her arm, gesturing out with the battered sword while keeping tucked behind her shield as they circled one another, the fox still distracted with the bow. She spied the blood from her first arrow on its back left leg and struck out quickly at the wound, earning the sounds of a crack from her sword and a yelp of pain from the dire fox as it staggered about, still frustratingly impaired. Atehn lunged towards its dizzied head and brought Ingel down in a concussive blow onto the top, the wooden blade finally breaking off at the hilt. The grisly creature let out a shrill howl and spun about, brushing Atehn away with its dark, grimy tail. This sent her sprawling while it retreated backward. Buffering itself with its tail, the bruised animal shook its head violently, causing its ears to flap loudly before continuing to paw and gnaw at the bow. As Atehn recovered from being knocked aside, she gripped the broken friend and tucked the dagger-like shards close to the shield, fearing to get close enough to use it. She tried not to think about it. She also used those seconds to stagger blindly backwards towards the door, finally letting out cries for her mother. On the other side, Wensy was panicking from having watched the unnecessary intervention from the poor vantage points of various windows, and now she rushed to the door. As she fumbled with the locks, she wished her daughter had simply remained hidden until the beast had wore itself out or Pax had returned. Atehn heard the scraping and clicking of mechanisms behind her, but watched with dismay as the fox finally managed to paw the bow off of its face. It turned towards her just as the hinges began to creak, those piercing eyes illuminating from the glow of the hearth inside, while somehow darkening with desperation at the same time. Before she could either slip through or warn her mother to keep the door shut, the wretched thing bounded for her as she raised her shield high. She closed her streaming eyes, cursed her foolishness, and screamed through tears, knowing that she would soon die if not aided. There was a sound like the buzzing of dragonflies, a gurgling crack, then a thud as the spasming corpse of the grime-covered fox collapsed in a heap at her feet. Blood pooled from its head, front and back, where a sleek, steel-tipped arrow pierced the skull at an angle, coming out the left eye. She followed the trajectory of the shaft and saw her father standing on the shore, dripping wet, bow in hand, another arrow already drawn and trained on the body. There was a coldness on his face she had never seen before. When the body stilled, their eyes met. He seemed to snap back to life, his face melting into relief as he lowered his weapon and sprinted to scoop her up. Wensy embraced the two of them with a sob, at which Jabala started crying. She retreated to retrieve the child and returned as Paxon shut the door. The four of them slumped together into the floor weeping, where they exchanged hugs and kisses while recounting their version of the experience. Atehn, still shocked, told her account last. She also answered her mother's query of where the dire fox had come from by confessing to her vandalism of what she discovered was an intentional barrier her grandparents had cultivated. Apparently, her little secret was actually an old family one, but while learning more about their woodland alliance was intriguing, the helplessness and futility she had just endured overshadowed her mind. She sat blankly, looking at her feet, vividly aware it could have been her blood on the fox's toes instead of the other way around. Later, her parents would say it seemed she aged a few years that very night. Atehn didn't touch a weapon nor went behind the burrow except to gather firewood for the rest of the season and through the winter. Eventually, as the magic of spring renewed the wildlife of the hollow, her vigor, courage, and curiosity was restored after so many months restrained. By the time the first flowers were blooming, she was back to roaming, but the wisdom and experience gained from that night left her more cautious and attentive than before. Though she was unwilling to take a life and skipped Pa's hunts, they resumed training and sparring when he was home. Paxon only left the hollow again after the breach of the briars had regrown, and Atehn started to accompany him on trade runs once Wensy and little Liabella were healthy and moving about. Another baby girl at her breast, Wensy finally made her peace with her daughter's wanderlust, which counterbalanced the anxiety that weighed on her each moment Atehn was out of her sight over the following years.